we look at Chapter 2 of Utilitarianism, what utilitarianism is. This is really the most important, I guess, because we ask ourselves, what is Chapter 1 about? It's really about the need for a criterion of right and wrong in morality, something that would give us a rule for distinguishing between things that should be done and things that should not be done, and maybe amongst things that are good to do, what's better. And so it's here in Chapter 2 that Mill gives us his candidate for what that rule is. It's what we're familiar with already, the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility, which appears here in the second paragraph. And the rest of it, which you got to read, to see what he says. But the rest of it is really a defense, and the next reading too, a defense, an explanation of, and a defense of the greatest happiness principle, or the principle of utility. And um, what is he concerned with? What does he think people will object to in his definition of right and wrong? Well, one of the there's maybe two main elements to the principle of utility, and the first is that what makes an action right or wrong is whether or not it promotes happiness for human beings. And the second element is a definition of happiness. Happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain, and unhappiness is pain and the privation of pleasure, the taking away of pleasure. It seems that Mill is anticipating some objections to that, and we see is the main concern that he has, fear that he has, is that people will misunderstand him when he says that happiness is merely pleasure. And really, he's defending that definition of happiness as pleasure. He refers here, for instance, you see, to the Epicureans. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher who said more or less the same thing. The whole point of life was pleasure and avoidance of pain. So Mill is actually, it's what we would call hedonism. Hedonism is simply the idea that pleasure is what is the good. It comes from hedone, the Greek word for pleasure. So what we see in his reference to really his invocation of Epicurus and the Epicureans is that he sees himself in a long line of hedonists. That is, people who have said that, well, the point of life is to maximize the amount of enjoyment you get out of it, and to minimize the amount of pain you have to suffer. But he says he, as well as the ancient Epicureans, had to deal with misunderstandings of that. What do you mean, pleasure? Are we pigs? This is a swinish philosophy. If all we're meant to do is to maximize the amount of pleasure that we feel, then we're just like animals. And the response to that is quite interesting, and something we have to talk about. Basically, saying that you misunderstand me. When I say that pleasure is the good, I mean human pleasure, which includes physical pleasures, the kind of physical pleasures that we share with animals, like pigs, but it also includes the intellectual pleasures, the social pleasures, he even says moral pleasures, the kind of pleasures that we can enjoy because we are human beings, that are proper to human beings. And he calls those the higher pleasures. And he makes some very daring assertions, I would say, about those higher pleasures. And one of the things that he says is that they're simply more pleasurable than the lower pleasures. The lower pleasures are the pleasures of the body. Food, drink, sex is pretty good list. The higher pleasures are the pleasures of the mind and the feelings. If one of the lower pleasures is the pleasures we get from eating, one of the so-called higher pleasures is the pleasure we get from reading a good book, or seeing a good film, or listening to music, or engaging in conversation with other human beings. And Mill makes the daring claim, I would say the daring claim, that these pleasures are more pleasurable, that they're more inherently pleasurable. So that when we say that pleasure is happiness or happiness is simply pleasure, he means all the pleasures and especially the higher ones. And he makes this, again, daring claim that the higher, so-called higher pleasures are more pleasurable. And his, you can see, I won't tell you, but that's part of, you got to read it, what case he makes for, for that claim that the higher pleasures are more intrinsically pleasurable. It's actually quite interesting. And, it's an interesting claim. It may or may not be true, but it's very important to him to try to make that case.